That joke isn't funny anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and today I am so happy to be joined by my next guest. He is the author of this awesome book called Last Call for Bud Light. His name is Anson Frericks. And Anson, I want to let everybody know that I have a signed copy of this. It's legit. And it says, Lou, bring out your best. And I wish I could, Anson, for you today. But I'm in pain a little bit. I want to just tell you just a little bit about the pain I'm in. I technically train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I haven't trained Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in like maybe close to 2 years. So I decided to go back yesterday, and I got so beaten up. My ankle is mangled. I can't breathe because my left lung is just terrible. So my apologies for not bringing out my best for you today, dude.
Hey, Lou, don't worry about it. You know, it's Bud Light, which is the story about that this book's about. They haven't brought out their best over the last couple of years. But it's funny enough, when the company originally launched Bud Light, so when Anheuser-Busch launched Bud Light in 1982, its original tagline was "Bring out your best." So there's always an opportunity to bring it back. I'm sure you'll recover really quickly, get back out on the mat, and be back to fighting form in no time here.
Thanks, man. It was such a reminder of how much I don't want to fight anybody. Sometimes you walk out in the world. Sometimes, you have a few buds in you. You're like, oh man, I got some, some beer muscles or whatever. And it was such
you get the liquid courage. That's it.
Oh yeah. And I've been there, especially in my youth, thanks to Bud Heavies mostly. That was my my drink and my family's drink of choice. Yeah.
Yeah, I was a big Bud Heavy guy. I probably had more Bud Heavies than any other beers in my life, and I don't know. There was something always about Budweiser as well. I mean, it was the Great America kind of beer. I always said it was America in a bottle is what Budweiser was. It's Clydesdales and it's sports, and they did an unbelievable job, especially when I was growing up. And think about the amazing commercials they had with Budweiser frogs and the Was Up guys, and it was iconic stuff. So I'm with you. That was my favorite beer.
Yeah, and I kind of forgot just how easy of a drink it was. Like people make the joke like, oh, it's like water, and it's like, well, sometimes if you're tailgating, or you want to hang out in your backyard for like 8 hours, and you want to be drinking something that's close to water.
Yeah, I mean, the lager style of beer, which is what Budweiser is. It's the most popular style across the world. So it doesn't matter what country you're in. People like drinking lagers because they're sessionable, they're good. And I don't know, like when I was in my late 20s and 30s, I probably, got caught up in the IPA craze where I was drinking IPAs all day, every day. But now that I'm in my 40s, like I just can't drink IPAs anymore. I mean, it feels like I drink 1 or 2 IPAs, like Mike Tyson was just pounding on my kidneys. So I'm back to drinking lagers again. So I get it.
Yeah, I was never able to get into the IPAs. I have a buddy of mine who's huge into them, and he would give me, and they're from all over the place, all these like different microbreweries and stuff. And he asked me like, "What does this taste like?" And I'm like, "Well, it tastes like dirty socks and like fear." And he's like, "Yeah, man, that's a good one. That's the one we want there." And I don't know if I just don't have the palate where I'm able to really appreciate something that tastes so weird, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people used to tell me it tastes like, pine tar, like they were literally eating a pine tree. And, I don't know. There's certain people, I think IPAs really start in the Pacific Northwest. I know there's a lot of pine trees out in the Pacific Northwest. So that palate's definitely out there. I don't know, for a little bit I had it, but like I said, I mean, I just can't do it anymore. So back to drinking mostly lagers these days. Not nearly as many Bud Lights as I used to, but more, I guess probably Coors Banquets these days is probably my go-to, or some Modelo's as well.
There we go. So I brought up my my injury because when the way that I met you at a great book event that Mark Gerson put on at his home in New York City, and a lot of your friends came out. It was a really good gathering. I think it was just such a great sales pitch for the book and the career that you had, and you opened up. Mark had you tell a story about what happened to you like the day before you were interviewing for this life-changing job. And I don't know if you want to, rehash that. I'm sure everybody wants to hear the story because it is actually one of the best stories that I've heard in a really long time. So maybe you could just hit us with it.
Yeah, maybe this was a harbinger of things to come, but I can only say it because I have a nice smile now. But for the crowd that's out there, this was during my second year of business school, and I was in a final round interview with the Anheuser-Busch InBev board of directors. I was flying from Boston, Massachusetts, where I was going to business school, down to New York the next day to have a meeting with them. And the night before, I was playing racquetball with my roommate from business school, and my roommate was a little bit upset at me because I was beating him, and so he gave a real vicious backhand with his racquetball racket when he was hitting, and his racket went right through my front two teeth, right to the back of my mouth. The night before a final round interview that I was having, and so this is probably at 7 o'clock at night, and it's really hard to find a dentist at 7 o'clock at night anywhere. Luckily, my girlfriend and now at the time and now wife, she called every single dentist office in Boston, happened to find some guy who was doing, I don't know, bills or taxes or something, and said, hey, I can come take a look at his teeth, but I don't have any assistants. You're going to have to help be my dental assistant. And so myself and my girlfriend show up, and my girlfriend, she's literally the one who was like holding the mirror and holding like the suction thing in as this dentist is kind of cobbling my teeth back together, puts them back in, and says, hey, you're not gonna be able to bite into anything, but at least you'll have teeth for the interview tomorrow. And so showed up the next morning, mentioned the board that I had lost some teeth, so it was a little bit hard to talk. And the guy, Georgie Paul, the board, and he was actually a former tennis champ at Wimbledon, or played at Wimbledon. He said, you can't play racquetball. You got to play tennis. We should play tennis sometimes because you won't lose your teeth playing tennis. So anyway, it was a good icebreaker. Ended up getting the job. That's how I ended up at Anheuser-Busch for about 11 years.
Yeah, it's such a great story, and also I think there's probably a part of it where on like maybe like a primitive level, like you come in there having lost your teeth and gone through all that, they're like, okay, this is a tough dude here. This is a guy that we could lean on.
100%. It's a good way to separate yourself from the other people that were interviewing that day. I don't think anybody had a story of they were at the dentist chair till 10 o'clock the night before, getting their teeth put back in their face so they could show up for an interview. And they show up with an interview, someone able to speak. And I think they appreciate that toughness, the grit, the grittiness, showing up and persevering through tough times and making things happen. So anyway, that's how I got the job.
Yeah, and I was just wondering about kind of like racquetball and racquetball itself, because like in like movies in the 80s, anytime there was like kind of like a corporate merger or like guys competing against each other, they always kind of they always had the scene, the metaphor of them playing racquetball and going at each other. And I'm just wondering, was that like when you got into racquetball, were you thinking, was that a part of it? Were you like, oh, I've seen this in movies before?
I just think of racquetball as like the ultimate 80s sport. I grew up in the Midwest, and then in the Midwest, they had racquetball courts. Like, squash was a sort of like, East Coast, more like elitist sport. But I remember in the 80s, like my dad wearing like sweatpants and sweatshirts and playing racquetball. And I don't know, that's what I grew up playing. And I always liked playing it. I thought it was a ton of fun. So yeah, I think about that a little bit, but it's mostly from my childhood and growing up in the 80s. And that's what we had in the Midwest in the wintertime. That's what you played.
Yeah. And then when you play, like when you're playing against, your boss in tennis, right? What does that competition look like? I mean, obviously he was a former pro, so I could understand, if there's, maybe he's serving you an ass kicking, but like, if you're like, say you yourself are on the same level, like how do bosses take it? If you beat them, if you're, uber competitive, do they respect that? Or is there a way is there like a fine line you have to walk between kicking your boss's ass?
Funny enough, even though he offered to play tennis at some time, I'm not a really good tennis player. So I actually never took him up on the offer to play. I took the job and I just worked hard and then was able to get promotions. I didn't want to let him know that I actually wasn't a very good tennis player. So I'm trying to think though, if I've ever kind of like played more of my bosses in sports. I don't know. Maybe when I was in my first finance job that I had in Boston, I worked at a private equity firm in Boston. We used to play actually hockey, and there would be like sort of an associates versus some of the other bosses in hockey. But that was kind of like a no holds barred. Everybody went at it really hard. We used to do baseball games, softball games as well. And I think that people like really respect, especially the bosses that were coming out there and people that were working hard and making things happen. So I don't think that they want to just be kind of allowed to like beat the young bucks. They want to have a good game, and they were all competitive too.
Yeah, when I grew up playing ice hockey, and I played like through high school, and I haven't skated in like over 20 years. And my youngest son just started lessons, so it's gotten me out onto the ice again. And I still have it. Like maybe I have like 40% of it, like skating. But it was just such a reminder of just watching my son learn this new activity, this new sport, and then me going back into it. I'm like, holy shit! Like it's really hard, man. Like especially skating itself is hard enough, and then transferring it, moving on up to hockey. It's like, man, I played a grueling sport for a good amount of my young life.
Yeah, but I think that especially in my business life, I don't know. There's like I gravitate towards athletes, and athletes because like, they have to get up early and they have to work out and they have to have discipline and it's hard and it's training and there's wins and there's losses. And then also I love athletics because it's the ultimate meritocracy. It's people don't care, what you look like, what your background is, how much money your parents have. It's like, man, can you put points on the board? Can you be a good teammate? So I tend to feel that if you take a look at a lot of successful people in life, whether it's in politics, whether it's in business, whether it's in even like music, arts, a lot of them have actually athletic backgrounds because of that competitive spirit, and that just tends to transfer, I think, really, really well into the business world.
Yeah, and I think that works well as well when it comes to Bud Light, because anytime that I think of Bud Light, I wouldn't think of necessarily a color, an ethnicity. I would just think of kind of dudes. Like I would just think of like guys. Your story obviously is, talks about, the downfall of Bud Light and where they went wrong. And, if you were to, I don't know, pinpoint a date, where do you think Bud Light went wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the date for me is really where call it Bud Light. And I would say Anheuser-Busch went wrong was they moved their sales and marketing organization out of St. Louis, Missouri in 2015. And they did this because the company was actually purchased about 6 years earlier by a European company called InBev. So kind of like the history of the company was InBev was this firm that was started by 3 Brazilian investment bankers. They kind of consolidated South America beer market. Then they went over to Europe and they bought InBev, which owned brands like Leffe, Hoegaarden, Stella Artois. And then in 2008, they bought Anheuser-Busch in the US. And Anheuser-Busch was this, very storied, amazing sort of a beer brand in the US, run by the Busch family for 4 generations. Incredible stories with the Busch family as well. They were great marketers. They were great branders. They spent a lot of money as well, which was part of the problem. I mean, not only did they, create the biggest beer brand in the US, but they kind of looked towards the US only. Then they started getting into things. They bought SeaWorld. They bought Busch Gardens. They were, spending all this money on a bunch of different things. They had, I think, like 7 helicopters, 10 private jets. You name it as a company, they had it all. It was almost excessive. And when you had actually this, like it was actually a smaller but more nimble, more profitable business that was more focused on cost cutting, they actually came in and they bought Anheuser-Busch in the US in 2008. Very contentious overthrow. And it was like really 2 different cultures that were kind of butting heads. One of InBev, more zero-based budgeting, cost conscious, running it really as the world's largest private equity firm that happened to sell beer is what they talked about, versus this like great branding, great marketing campaign. And then actually for the first couple of years, I would say the company actually kind of like worked out all right. They kind of took the best of both worlds. They managed their costs better, but then they held on to a bunch of their kind of senior marketing executives to make sure that the brands were still resonating with American consumers. But it was really 2015. And that was the year that all of a sudden InBev decided that St. Louis was no longer a great place to do marketing and recruit talent and being able to have sales, despite it working for 150 years for the Busch family. And they moved it to New York City. And that to me was sort of the beginning of the end, where now all of a sudden you're hiring different people. You're looking at America not through St. Louis, Missouri, which like you draw a 50-mile radius around St. Louis, Missouri, and you have farm fields, you have urban areas, you have suburbs, you have a good sort of microcosm of the United States. Whereas in New York City, you draw a 50-mile radius around New York City and you have New York City. That's effectively all that you have. And I think that was really where I started pinpointing the downfall, starting this 2015, moving from St. Louis to New York City.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is odd when people come in to such a historic brand with such an identity, and then they start thinking, oh, but I want it to be more like me, and it's like rather than saying, no, I'm gonna change my view of I'm going to change my perspective on and try to understand what this brand is. It's like no, there's I don't know, I'm just imagining like there's a cat cafe that I attend, and somehow Budweiser, Bud Light needs to, speak to those people. And it's like, well, they don't speak to those people. So why, you're kind of forcing this thing to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, and I think that this foreign ownership group that was run by now a group of Brazilians and Belgians in 2015, for them, they saw St. Louis as this sort of like backwater flyover part of the country. We don't want to live there. Our spouses don't want to live here. And that's when they sort of, again, moved the company to New York City. And then all of a sudden, I mean, they really sort of adopted a different view of, I think, who their customer was. I mean, now all of a sudden, instead of their customer being predominantly Midwest, predominantly suburban, rural areas where they had 50, 60, 70% market share in a lot of those sort of middle estates, now all of a sudden they're looking at New York City where they only had maybe 20% market share. A little bit of a different consumer, a little bit of a different mindset there. And even sort of a different, over that time period, evolution and what sort of the purpose of a company was and what they were supposed to be. Kind of prior to this, even the 2015, 2016 timeframe, all businesses in the US, they really abided by what Milton Friedman used to say was the purpose of a corporation, which was since the 1970s, it was focus on your shareholders, give them great products and services. That's going to allow the company to continue to grow and hire more people and innovate and generate more revenue and pay taxes and do all the things that companies do. But really in sort of the 2016, 17, 18 timeframe, especially after Trump was elected, there was this now evolvement of the purpose of a corporation in the US because people saw Trump pulling back from things like the Paris Climate Accords, pulling back from the United Nations Human Rights Coalition. And he was saying in a lot of these more progressive institutions, sovereign wealth funds, they started saying, well, if government's not going to solve these existential crises of human rights issues or of climate change, we now need businesses doing this. And there was a group called the Business Roundtable in 2017, 2018, in the United States, where they actually evolved the purpose of a corporation away from Milton Friedman says the focus on shareholder value to more of this European view of the world, which says you have to focus on stakeholders and stakeholder value. This was sort of the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum, like kind of global Davos crowd that really evolved this purpose of the corporation. And they did it with a lot of actually dollars. I mean, like anything, you follow the money. They did it with the heft of big asset management companies, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, that managed $20 trillion worth of capital. And we're adopting more of this progressive stakeholder capitalism, ESG, DEI philosophy, because they get a lot of their money from the pension funds from California, pension funds from New York, pension funds from European sovereign wealth funds. We're sort of more foisting this different agenda onto them to manage their money. And unfortunately, you saw a lot of a lot of corporations that started to get lost around this time frame. Anheuser-Busch, unfortunately, being the biggest culprit.
Yeah, and just the whole idea of shareholders versus stakeholders. I mean, shareholders, you can measure it. I mean, it seems like you know how much product you're selling or how much services and where that money's going. Whereas the idea of a stakeholder, it's like, how how much carbon did we somehow suck out of the air by buying this thing or any of the other like environmental issues, like, oh, we're really cutting down on climate change through this company or this one way or another. It seems like the stakeholder capitalism has a lot of like either wishful or magical thinking behind it.
Yeah, Lou, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, the whole like stakeholder philosophy is when you try and be everything to everyone, you end up being nothing to anyone. And the problem with that whole stakeholder model is you're trying to serve, hundreds of gods. There's, your shareholders are just one of them, but then you also have to have activists and government officials and community members and suppliers. And you go down the list, it's almost infinite. And that model, it never tells you who is supposed to be the one that you serve prior to others. The shareholder model is very simplistic. It's like when you do what's right for shareholders and you generally think about from a long-term view what's going to generate dollars to my shareholders, you tend to benefit all these other organizations as well. But when push comes to shove, you have to do what's right for the shareholders. In a stakeholder model, you can have certain stakeholders that take precedence over your shareholders. And that's really what happened in this whole like 2019 to really 2024 timeframe. In the last 5 years, we're kind of crazy in business, where you had a lot of corporations that really lost focus on their mission. I attribute a lot of this back to, yes, the rise of the stakeholder capitalism movement, the business roundtable evolving the purpose of a corporation. I say that set a lot of sort of like kindling for what became a bonfire really in the COVID timeframe. And if you think about it during the COVID timeframe, COVID hits in 2020, and this is right after the Business Roundtable had adopted the purpose of a corporation, right after firms like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the world's largest asset management companies, started telling companies that they were going to force agendas on them. This is Larry Fink's words, who's the CEO of BlackRock. He's going to like force change at companies that aren't getting behind his environmental, social, and governance agenda, or his diversity, equity, inclusion, his DEI agenda. And since they're the largest, the largest allocators of capital to these companies, they have disproportionate ability to vote for shareholder proposals or to advocate for change. And especially when COVID hit, you have this existential crisis of COVID that everyone's saying we got to shut down, we got to flatten the curve, we got to do everything we can to protect people. A lot of misinformation, a lot of kind of gray areas going on. Not to talk about COVID, but the thing was, you had a bunch of corporations that were forced to shift their mission. All of a sudden, you had companies like Anheuser-Busch. We were making hand sanitizer because we had to make hand sanitizer. You had General Electric that's making ventilators because all of a sudden we need more ventilators. You have Delta Airlines no longer flying passengers, but for the first time in history is flying medical supplies around the country. So all this is going on. And within, kind of 2 months, we realized that this curve had been flattened, hospitals weren't overrun, this crisis had like relatively passed. But all of a sudden, since corporations, they had evolved their missions, and all of a sudden they were serving all these other different stakeholders, all of a sudden this next invisible crisis pops up, this next existential crisis pops up, which was the death of George Floyd. And when George Floyd's murdered, all of a sudden there's this call afterwards that we have to stamp out systemic racism in this country, which, systemic racism, of course, this is, like problem for people to solve, but was it for companies to get involved in these issues? And as you might recall, right afterwards, almost every company in the United States was compelled to put up sort of like a black square for Black Lives Matter, or give, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to corporations. They all of a sudden, there was a massive increase in every company having to hire a chief diversity officer. There were tons of corporations that decided to put in quota systems for companies that they were going to hire, a certain number of people that were born looking this way or that way. And even it got to the point where, Target and others, they were saying that they were going to allocate shelf space at their retail stores based off of race or sex. It got to the point where it's crazy. Coca-Cola said, I think 35% of the billable hours for law firms that they employed had to be through Black lawyers. It was like everyone's putting these sort of quota systems
Wow.
in. And, it got to almost like crazy things companies were doing in the name of sort of stakeholder capitalism, and then that companies were now supposed to solve all these other sort of like more social justice issues, and that really became problematic.
It reminds me during COVID, my wife and I, we lived in Brooklyn Heights, and one of the restaurants in our neighborhood, solid restaurant. They sent out an email, basically, saying, okay, here are our hours, like you would normally see, and then this whole block of text talking about how they are doing all they can to fight systemic racism. And they want this to be a safe place for our allies or people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just all this, kind of woke BLM boilerplate. And my wife and I, we started talking about it. And I'm like, well, I really wish that they would put less salt in their food, because the last time we ate there, it was really salty and I didn't really want to go back. And it was just such an example of like, and this is it's a small restaurant. Maybe it's like 50 seats there. And I guess if you sort of blow that up to an entire corporation or a conglomerate trying to do these things, and it's like, wait a minute, you're not focusing on what you really should be focusing on, which is your goods and services that you're putting out there.
Yeah, that's it. And I don't know this restaurant in Brooklyn. Who knows? Maybe their clientele, they want to fight all that. And they're the owner of
the clientele. The clientele are all white.
Yeah.
Just want you know, which is hilarious. I'm like, I've never seen a black person in here, but what are you? So.
Yeah, I mean, but the whole issue that became very problematic to me, and I was actually living in Atlanta, Georgia, and saw this sort of firsthand. This was in the year 2021, where I don't know if you remember this, but there was Governor Kemp, who was the governor of Georgia. He signed an order for these. It was a Georgia Voting Laws Act, and this Georgia Voting Laws Act, it made sure that you have to have an ID to vote, which I think 30 states have. Then it opened up like actually more access to voting and more polling stations and a bunch of other things, but there was a massive pushback on this. You might remember Joe Biden said this was Jim Crow 2.0, Jim Crow in the 21st century. And BlackRock, this large asset manager that I mentioned, that is the largest asset manager in the world, they said, we're pushing back on this. This is wrong for Georgia. And then all these other companies, because BlackRock is the single largest shareholder in most of them and has an outsized influence, they started speaking up as well. I mean, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a publicly traded company, serves millions of customers all over the United States, and the world. Has a very diverse employee base, and their CEO said we're against this law and we're going to push back on it. Delta Airlines, which is flying people around, they're pushed back on it. And Major League Baseball, you might remember this, they canceled the All-Star game, which was in Atlanta in 2021 over this law, which was simply a law that was just like, you need to have an ID to vote. And they moved this All-Star game to Denver, Colorado, which is very comical because I've lived in Denver, Colorado as well. And Colorado is probably like the whitest city I've ever lived in. And Atlanta is probably like the most diverse city that I've lived in. And it's just crazy that you were going to move this All-Star game, which is going to massively benefit a lot of African Americans in Georgia over this law. And the funny thing is like now the All-Star game is coming back to Atlanta this year. Nothing's changed. The law's still there, but all of a sudden companies were just getting involved in sort of this, I don't know, political zeitgeist that they had to be compelled to try and be everything to everyone and try and serve all these different stakeholders and try and do social engineering of a lot of social justice issues, and just none of it made any sense. And I think this is really the problem that we saw with corporations. And ultimately, the business is lost because millions of their customers, they ended up choosing other brands. And then also it was bad for democracy as well, because instead of folks like you and I, Lou, that are voting for our representatives that put in laws, and that's how our democracy works. Now all of a sudden we have this small group of kind of like CEOs and corporations and asset managers that are trying to social engineer policies that they want. I don't know, that feels very European to me, very monarchical to me, and not the way that we operate here in the US.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it is due to capitalism getting a bad rap. I mean, you brought up Milton Friedman, who, I mean, to this day, I mean, I rewatched the same clips of him from the 80s, making arguments, for laissez-faire capitalism or the free market, and arguments definitely against socialism. And it's one of these things where I think even people, you'll often hear when it comes to the idea of like shareholders, it's people over profits. They're choosing profits over people, and like not even understanding just how important and how tenuous the relationship already is between a company and its customers, especially where a customer has so many choices, and the relationship there that, I'm going to choose to, drink Bud Light, or I'm going to drink Coca-Cola versus anything else. Like that relationship is already such an incredible thing. And to chalk that up to be like, I don't know, to view it as something nefarious, I think is been a real big problem.
No, Lou, I completely agree with you. I mean, if you take a look over the last, call it 100 years, there has been no better system in the world that has lifted people out of poverty, improved living standards, led to innovation than American free market shareholder capitalism. That says, hey, businesses, go out, define your mission, define your purpose, raise capital from shareholders, go out, compete, make a profit, hire people, hire more people, do more innovation, serve your customers. There's been no better system than that to, again, raise people out of poverty. I mean, it's amazing here in the United States that if you take a look at some of the poorest states that we have in the United States, they're wealthier than most of the European counterparts. And if you look at over the last 40 years, when you've had sort of this debate of the Milton Friedman view of the world versus the Klaus Schwab European stakeholder capitalism view, I mean, on almost every single kind of broad-based economic and prosperity metric, the U.S. trounces Europe. Our stock market returns have been at 10% a year over the last 40 years. Europe's at 7%. And to put that in context, you had $100,000 in 1970 invested in the U.S. stock markets, it'd be worth $4.5 million today, whereas in Europe, it'd be worth $1.5 million. I mean, that compounding interest is massive massive over time. And if you take a look at U.S. versus Europe over the last 40 years as well, like U.S.'s GDP growth, per capita income, unemployment rates, interest rates, I mean, all beat Europe on every single metric. Yet there was this sort of movement towards this, again, this European stakeholder capitalism type of model, which just doesn't make any sense for society or for businesses. So now, that being said, there are some bumps along the way because, with kind of capitalism, even though it's produced incredible outcomes and returns for most people, and even, I mean, the poorest people in the U.S. live like kings compared to, what people were living 100 years ago. There tends to be bumps. The latest bump that we had was in 2008, 2009. That was when you had sort of this great recession, and there was the financial crisis where, a lot of banks, they had lended to people that frankly probably shouldn't have been lent to. There was a whole subprime mortgage crisis. A lot of people lost their homes along the way. And there was this feeling that banks got bailed out, that people lost their homes. Banks got bailed out. There was this whole Occupy Wall Street movement that pops up. We are the 1%. And then all of a sudden, capitalism had to do a little bit of a repair job and figure out, okay, how do we kind of repair our image? And around this time, this is when you had sort of this concept of ESG, environmental social governance, had kind of popped up in 2005 in the United Nations. So banks started kind of picking that up in that 2011, 12, 13 timeframe of, okay, well, how can business just do better? And so what started out as I would say is probably probably a good intent just to do a PR campaign around all the good that business does. Unfortunately, over the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, especially when Trump was elected, was all of a sudden weaponized and politicized to all of a sudden compel businesses to try and get done a lot of social and political issues through sort of the back door of business that government could not get done through the front door.
Yeah. I was actually driving with my wife the other day, and we were driving back from my parents, and I told her to look up this little factoid that Mississippi has a greater GDP than England and possibly Great Britain. And you hear numbers like that, and it seems, how could that possibly be true? How could that be true? And I think a lot of it's just the reality of, I think a lot of people are just incapable of seeing beyond what's in front of them or what's right in their home. They just take for granted every single thing that we have. Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. And a lot of people think of, when you think of England, you think of London. Okay, great. London's the financial capital, but there's a lot of places that are obviously outside of London that have really fallen behind because they haven't innovated. They haven't had new businesses pop up. They don't have sort of the startup entrepreneurial culture that we have here in the United States. And even in a place like, people think of Mississippi, but in Mississippi, there's a lot of enterprises going on. There's a lot of businesses that are being started. There's a lot of technology that's coming to places like Mississippi. And there's a lot of logistics that are happening in places like Mississippi. So even here, I mean, it's amazing that, yes, some of our poorest states are wealthier than a lot of our European counterparts. And we just completely forget about that. And we don't do a good enough job from a PR standpoint of explaining that. And of course, there's still work for Mississippi to do to probably close gaps to some of the other states in this country. But we're much better off than almost any other country in Europe.
Yeah, and I think it's a testament to how great capitalism is. If you live online as much as I do on like X and stuff, and you see what the conversation is like, where one of the latest ones is comedian Bill Burr talking, blaming blaming a lot of stuff on billionaires and saying that billionaires should be taken out and put down like rabid dogs. And I think it's such an amazing testament to capitalism, the fact that Bill Burr is a multimillionaire. So it's like, my God, things are so good where millionaires are saying, no, don't look at me. Look at these guys. Don't, if you're going to put anybody down like a rabid dog, not the millionaires, please make sure it's the billionaires.
And it's crazy as well. Yeah, there was something I was taking a look at on X last night. A lot of people were reposting, mostly from the left, talking about, Elon Musk, he hasn't given money to like open up healthcare systems or to like, I don't know, all these other, clinics or to open schools or to you name it. And it's like, well, guys, but like, look what Elon Musk has done. I mean, he has Tesla, which is like a whole entire country, a whole company dedicated to, clean energy and battery cars and you kind of name it. legitimate. Other people say, okay, he hasn't given money to hospitals, but he has this company called Neuralink. He's literally investing billions of dollars to build a company that's going to allow people that can't walk or that can't communicate to all of a sudden be able to use their brain waves to be able to communicate, to be able to work with sort of like robotic apparatuses, to be able to walk again. I mean, he's already doing it. And that's going to be, by the way, like much better for humanity and progress and technology than him like giving money to some hospital system that's just, working through the current, whatever medicines we have. This is a really sick country, by the way. We need to be doing things that are more innovative, getting us to be healthier, looking towards the future. That's much where I would much rather have Elon Musk getting and innovating and investing dollars in what the future is going to be than just investing in the current system that we know is especially broken in healthcare.
Yeah. And Elon Musk, just as a, as a figure, as a historical figure, I'm really amazed at just the visions that he has, like the things that you mentioned there. There's also Starlink, there's all this, the Boring Company, which is, making tunnels, underground and all that. And I think rather than look at that guy and say like, oh, it's son of a bitch, like, and trying to figure out how him having wealth is somehow taking away from my wealth. I can't do those, mental gymnastics. I mean, just the reality is like, I chose to be a comedian, so the value that I produce is the value I produce. And I often, I'll look at my resume and I'll look at my tax return. I'll be like, that makes sense. that makes sense that I am where I am. On a previous episode of my podcast, I had a nice conversation with an economics professor. And we were, talking about, capitalism in the United States in particular. And I told him that, two of the people that I know in the United States who either have or had Porsches, drove Porsches. One was a baker and one was a butcher. And I know the butcher because it's my dad, and I know the baker because it's my dad's friend. And these are two guys who, they got their Porsches later on in life. I think they're like both like in their 50s or 60s. But, we were both kind of just, just kind of in awe that, man, we live in a country where a baker and a butcher can drive a Porsche. Like, that is just amazing. It's incredible.
No, I mean, it's amazing. And I think that especially over the last 5 years, we lost this narrative of the American dream. The American dream is incredibly alive and well for people that want to work for it, that want to get up, that want to have discipline. I mean, but it's not going to be there if you're just going to be sitting around and, on your phone all day and not doing anything like that. It never has been. It's never been for anybody. And so that narrative was definitely lost. And I think that's one of the things that I think we all collectively as a society can do a better job moving forward of explaining that the American dream is incredibly alive and well for everybody. It doesn't matter what your background is, what your race is, skin color, etc. That for people who want to work hard in a merit-based society, you will get results. And it probably won't be immediate. It's not going to be tomorrow. Right. But if you have the discipline, you do the right things, you get an education, you work hard, that's still rewarded in this country. And we gotta make sure everyone understands that, because the inverse of that is exactly what the left is doing to Elon Musk. We're just trying to sort of tear him down and saying, we want to redistribute all of your wealth. We don't want you innovating. We don't want you taking your money and doing new, interesting things. We want to get redistributed to all these other people because that's, so-called fair. And I think that's where we get into a real problem, where we're taking sort of our best and brightest and we're shackling the best and brightest in the name of, redistribution or fairness. And that's not what this country ever was. And I don't think that's what this country should be.
Yeah. How have you felt about, like JD Vance going to Europe and, kind of sticking it to him? Now, I don't know if it's not necessarily the stuff that I've been hip to is a lot of the stuff about free speech and that sort of thing. And, calling out the Europeans for their lack thereof free speech. I like it. I really like that. In a way, I'm sort of like, oh, this is the America that I want, where we call out bullshit and we don't act like we're somehow inferior to Europe and Europeans. So.
No, I mean, I think that we in the U.S., we need to be leaders. And I don't think that, and I think instead of us going and, just imposing our will on others, I think that hasn't necessarily worked over the last couple of decades. But I think what will work is that we actually paint a picture of the future of the U.S. is going to be this, once again, this beacon of democracy, of free speech, of innovation. And you're going to see in the U.S. a lot of investment come here. There's going to be a lot of wealth that ends up being built here, even more so than we currently have. You're going to still want to see the best and the brightest come to the U.S. in a legal way from an immigration standpoint. And then that's actually going to be the example that we should set for the rest of the country. In places like Europe that are restricting free speech, they're going to see their best and brightest lead. Europe that's restricting kind of free trade, or Europe that's restricting innovation and the ability to start new companies, they're going to see people again leave, come to the US, and they're going to end up continue to trail behind the U.S. I think what you need in Europe is like a reawakening, and people to reimagine what Europe can be, that they can actually be leaders in free speech along with the U.S. They can be leaders in industry and innovation. They need to do a better job competing with us. You just can't live on, these legacy systems where every country over there is now taxing citizens at 40, 50, 60% because you have sort of this long inherited aristocratic wealth. Like, I even think a lot of the old aristocratic leaders of Europe, they need to get off their laurels. They need to start thinking about how they're going to make Europe, healthy. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. They don't have enough money to, whatever it is, beat back Russia, whoever is, coming in invading. I have no idea. But yeah, so I think that's probably the message that Europe needs to have. They need a little bit of a wake-up call. They need a little bit of a shake-up, and they need to sort of paint a better future of what Europe can be. In the same way that I think both Trump and Vance are painting this picture of what the U.S. can not only what it is, but what it can be moving forward. If we take care of our own interests, we take care of our people, we can make ourselves, healthier, wealthier, more educated. That's only going to set the right example for the whole rest of the world to follow.
Yeah. There's very much. Don't get me wrong. I've been to Europe a number of times. I love going to Spain. I've been in Italy and France, and just had wonderful times. But it does seem like very much when I go there, it's kind of a museum. It's kind of like here are these old ways of making some incredible food like that. That's fantastic. But ultimately, if you are going to grow as a country, you have to be progressing a lot farther than where you've come from, So.
Yeah, no, 100%. You have to keep moving forward. You have to keep innovating. Sure, it's nice going and seeing the Roman Colosseum and going and seeing the Eiffel Tower, but also you want to see what are the next great business. It's amazing when people come to the U.S. and they want to go visit the Gigafactory and Elon Musk rocket launches and Google headquarters or Facebook or even going and seeing, like factories. It's amazing going and seeing where I used to work at Anheuser-Busch. Seeing like the big factories and the mechanization, the innovation, is incredibly interesting and compelling. And then Europe needs to figure that piece out as well. And I think here in the U.S., we're doing hopefully Trump and Vance are going to set the right example about how do we live these ideals of freedom and capitalism and the American dream and others, and those ideals is what hopefully we're exporting more than anything. And we actually don't need to get involved in a lot of more foreign wars and foreign issues, because again, we're inspiring a whole generation of individuals in other countries to want the same things that we want here in the U.S., which I think is just core to the whole human experience. You want the ability to speak, you want the ability to work, you want the ability to learn, you want the ability to contribute, you want the ability to be judged. MLK, not by the color of your skin, by the content of your character. That's what everybody wants. I don't think that's necessarily like a uniquely American sort of phenomenon. I think most people around the globe want that, and the U.S. can set the tone, moving forward on how to get there.
Yeah, and so I know that you're good friends and business partners with Vivek. Do you know VP Vance as well? Did you go to school with him as well?
We Vance, we've been in a bunch of different circles at the same time. His company Nari actually invested into Strive. We're obviously both from Southwest Ohio. He was at Yale when I was at Harvard Business School, but we actually haven't overlapped much beyond that. So much closer with Vivek, who's launching his governor campaign next week in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'll see him there next week at that, which will be pretty fun, pretty exciting.
Nice. Yeah, I remember seeing Vivek at a lot of libertarian conferences and stuff. He really did the legwork, and I think ultimately, the work that he did, and then also RFK Jr., like the Maha people and the libertarians coming together. I think it was a really big boon for Trump, without a doubt. I sort of bring it up because it's like I'm going to be 43 this month, and it's a little wild. Seeing a vice president where I'm like, oh my God, I could have went to high school with that guy. It's like kind of aging myself, So.
Yeah, that they're here already. No, it's amazing the coalitions that I think sort of Trump brought together.
Yeah.
But I think that he focused on just areas that were frankly broken in this country, and people weren't making the hard decisions to try and correct them. What RFK's message. I mean, this is one of the issues that the U.S. does have. We're an unhealthy country. We spend way too much money on healthcare for the health outcomes that we have. We're spending almost more on GDP per capita on healthcare than almost every other advanced country, but we have worse outcomes. Part of that's related to the food supply that we have, and buying a bunch of food with sugars and artificial sweeteners and additives and others. And that might be something that, frankly, was probably more of a progressive movement over the last maybe 20 years. People more on the coast were more concerned about what they're eating and how healthy they are. But that's great to be able to bring now that message maybe to the rest of the country to eat healthier and maybe to go after sort of large food manufacturers that are putting in just additives that we don't need. I think it's great that Trump has figured out the immigration piece. And there's a lot of people, I think, now on the left and the right realized that immigration was broken, not only in terms of the illegal immigration coming in, but also how do we do legal immigration? Who needs to get into this country? How do we fix that? So it's good to see sort of the various coalitions that are coming together and hopefully rallying behind about how do we just make a better country for everybody.
And I think the level of discourse is a lot better now, even though things seem a lot more divisive. And I'll give an example. Like during the Biden administration, one thing that I noticed when it came to immigration was that people kind of stopped talking about racism in regards to illegal immigration. When undocumented migrants were being bussed and shipped to Martha's Vineyard, then the same people who would often bring up saying, oh, you're so racist that you don't want these people over here, they dropped the racism thing and just started talking about logistics, like how many people are coming in? Oh, we don't have enough beds. We don't have enough of this. And then I think a lot of people just started seeing like, oh, maybe the people, in Texas in the border states, this is what they've actually been dealing with. And it's not some racist boogeyman.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, even a lot of those words lost their meaning over the last couple of years. Racist and bigot, and calling people Nazis and all this silliness stuff. Whereas a lot of people just all of a sudden raised their hand and said, wait a minute, all of a sudden I'm being called a racist because I don't want illegal immigration. Like all of a sudden, like illegal asking for there to be borders was meant you were racist. Like, well, no, I'm not racist. I just don't like illegal borders. I mean, this whole thing about being bigoted, like I talk about this in the book. Last Call for Bud Light, that the partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, that it didn't necessarily make a lot of sense for Bud Light as a brand because Bud Light never got involved in more political controversy. And Dylan Mulvaney was a very controversial, political figure in the transgender movement, advocating for biological men to compete against biological women in sports, advocating for gender affirmation care for people under the age of 18. And those are just very controversial political issues that was on almost every single state ballot over the last, couple of years. But just because all of a sudden, like I raised my hand and say, I don't think my 8-year-old daughter should be competing against, men in sports. Like, I don't think that makes me bigoted. I just think that I just have an opinion. And, do I care how, what someone over the age of 18 dresses like or calls themselves? Like, no, I could really care less. But all of a sudden I do care though, if they're imposing on me and imposing on their worldview on me or, my daughter and taking away, sports and educational opportunities for them. Like, I do have a problem with that. And I don't think that's a bigoted. That's just you should be able to have that opinion and be able to hopefully discuss it in a mutually respectful way. And I think that though, we need to get back to just not throwing around words that anytime you don't like the political opinion, you're bigoted or you're racist or you're a Nazi, because they've just lost all meaning at this point.
Yeah, no, totally. And that whole time period, it was so odd. And it was just like, who made this decision? And, you could tell us who made this decision to bring on Dylan Mulvaney, because I guess if you were just looking at, like, if you had no idea who Dylan Mulvaney was and you're just looking at numbers, like, this is a really popular person on TikTok, like, we gotta get this person involved. Okay, I could see that, but obviously that's not the whole story, right?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there was a VP of Bud Light named Alyssa Heinerschneid who was, I mean, in her mind, she was much more progressive. She had been featured in the New Yorker as organizing all of these like the female women's summits for certain issues, and was more progressive. And she thought that you needed to evolve the brand and make it more inclusive. And she had this, in her words, very clear mandate to do so. So she was responsible for the Dylan Mulvaney campaign. But I think that the broader piece around, but why did we even get to this point where Bud Light was choosing to work with a controversial political figure? This was actually part of the broader narrative that the book discusses, that in the 5 to 10 years previously, having this sort of, I call it, it's almost like a cartel of a lot of progressive pension funds and sovereign wealth funds putting pressure on the large asset managers in the U.S. that control a lot of the shares and voting practices to implement more of a progressive ESG, DEI philosophy. You had the Biden administration as well that was putting a lot of pressure on companies. I mean, you saw the podcast with Mark Zuckerberg and Joe Rogan, where Zuckerberg is saying, like, yeah, people from the Biden administration, they were calling us, telling us to take down just factual information, literally censoring speech on the internet. There were these nonprofit, these stakeholders we talked about earlier, called the Human Rights Campaign, that they were scoring companies and scoring them on how diverse and equitable and inclusive they were, scoring them on their transgender policies, of the healthcare policies that they had, scoring them on how many advertisements that they had. And these scores would be reported back to these large asset managers that would then include companies in certain fund indices that they would put more money into the company, which would theoretically, help the stock price. So that's the longer story. And that's really what this book kind of talks about, is how did that whole, call it ESG, DEI, stakeholder capitalism, industrial complex, infect so many different companies. Why was it bad for business, as we saw in the case of Bud Light, where it lost millions of customers, billions of dollars of shareholder value, thousands of employees have ended up, getting fired. Plus, you have a lot of suppliers that have gone out of business. That's really the company that was holding the pin when this whole bubble popped. How did that sort of happen? And then most importantly, what do all companies need to do moving forward to get back on track, get back to focused on their business? Why is that going to be good for their bottom line, for their shareholders? And then also, I think, society at large, when we're seeing some of this rollback going on right now of DEI, of ESG policies that became just increasingly controversial over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and obviously, anyone who's been following Bud Light, they'll notice the new series of commercials with Shane Gillis and Post Malone, who. It's like, yeah, they scream Bud Light, and they literally they actually drink Bud Light. Like Shane Gillis, when he's backstage, you could see him drinking a Bud Light. It makes so much sense. Do you think that is going to be enough, or do they need more time for people to forget, or what's the future of Bud Light going to look like?
Yeah, over the last kind of 2 years since this controversy, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They now sponsor the Ultimate Fighting Championship. They have Dana White. They have Shane Gillis. They have Post Malone. But their sales continue to plummet. They lost 30% of their sales when this first happened. And even last month, they lost another 30% of their sales. So, theoretically, this company has lost almost 50% of their sales since this has happened, with no turnaround in sight. I actually think that it's not going to turn around really until you have this European company, InBev, that actually sells Anheuser-Busch in the U.S. back to U.S. owners. Because even the management team of Anheuser-Busch, over the last 2 years, they never apologized for getting involved in the controversy with Dylan Mulvaney in the first place. These senior executives were not fired over this situation. And there's never been sort of clear accountability or even a rollback of some of the policies publicly that led to this. They haven't rolled back publicly the DEI policies, the ESG policies. They haven't clearly articulated what Bud Light's going to be. But I think actually, if you sold this business back to, call it, sell it to Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, and he's sitting on $300 billion of cash, or sold it back to, a consortium of private equity firms like Steve Schwarzman, Blackstone, you could actually sell this U.S. business unit, which is about, call it, a quarter of the total company's kind of business at this point in terms of its profits and revenue. I actually think that you could unlock a ton of value where you could all of a sudden have new CEOs, new executives, new owners say, hey, we're back, we're American owned, we're getting back to American values. This brand, once again, Bud Light, is going to be just focused on fun and sports and entertainment. Shane Gillis, if you guys love that, you're going to be getting tons more of that. Budweiser, you mentioned you love Budweiser. Hey, we're bringing back, the more, they had the Budweiser Clydesdale commercial in the Super Bowl this year. That was great. They won it. But hey, a lot more of that. I think they could gain back a ton of their customers. And I think also here in the US, they could build a pretty interesting, robust business again by not only just having beer, but then, add on Black Rifle Coffee Company, add on, Liquid Death, bring in a bunch of other brands that are very, distinct authentic to their customer base, and then you could make like an amazing company. So that's my hope for what happens moving forward. But I don't think anything's going to turn around until that happens.
Well, I think it basically writes itself. I mean, it's kind of it's a way to apologize without even apologizing, because the new owners can kind of mock the old ones. And also on the Black Rifle Coffee, you told a story, about early on saying, hey, we should take these guys on, and I guess they didn't take you up on that, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, that's how, you can read it more about that in the book. I'll give one more plug for Last Call for Bud Light here. But no, I mean, I even talk about that a lot, how I try to do this partnership with Black Rifle Coffee Company, and our team based in New York City, our external affairs kind of legal team, they killed that deal because they thought it was too controversial for us to do just like a distribution agreement with them. But all of a sudden, that was the same department that a year later greenlit the Dylan Mulvaney partnership. And they thought that was totally fine. And I mean, I think that shows just how far the company had strayed from its customer base and understood kind of who their customers were. But again, that's another reason that you could have a great American comeback story if the company potentially InBev sells Anheuser-Busch back in the U.S. I think it'd be a lot of fun to rebuild that company.
Awesome. Well, guys, you heard a little bit about it. Now read much more about it in Last Call for Bud Light. It's an awesome story. Anson tells it so well. And if you ever get to see him live speaking as well, like you really blew me away at the Gerson's event. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming. And guys, make sure you buy his book. And it always helps. Buy his book. Give it 5 stars. Write a review. Let's get that algorithm going. The man needs to sell some more books.
Great. Thank you very much, Lou. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on today.